Smoke still drifted above the harbours when the celebrations of liberation began to fade. In May 1945, towns along the Dalmatian coast rang bells, hung flags, and welcomed partisan units. But the joy stopped at the water's edge. Ports that had sustained them for centuries lay silent, blocked by wreckage. The war had ended on land, yet out on the sea, danger lingered with every shifting tide. Across Dalmatia, the first weeks after liberation carried a strange mixture of relief and unease. Split, Šibenik, Zadar, and Dubrovnik stood technically free, yet each remained surrounded by the physical debris of occupation. Scuttled German and retreating Italian vessels cluttered harbour entrances. Steel hulls rested half-submerged, forming jagged outlines that broke the surface at low tide. Beneath the waves, mines drifted unpredictably, some anchored, some loose, many unrecorded after German units burned or lost their logs during retreat. The sea that had once connected Dalmatian towns to each other and to the world had turned into a field of hidden traps. Damage on land was just as stark. Wartime evacuations and reprisals had emptied coastal communities. Entire neighbourhoods stood deserted. From Zadar, much of the population had fled after 1943, their return delayed by the city's heavy bombardment and the uncertainty of its political future. On the islands Hvar, Brač, Vis villages showed the marks of fire and forced removal. Many families had been evacuated to Italy or to the refugee camps at Shatt in Egypt, waiting for months in desert tents as the war's front lines shifted. When they finally began returning in mid-1945, they found homes roofless, fields overgrown, and harbours unusable. In the place of pre-war institutions, improvised local committees stepped in. These national committees, formed quickly as Axis authority collapsed, inherited the task of governing without preparation, staff, or equipment. Their offices often operated out of damaged municipal buildings where broken windows were covered with blankets or boards. Paper, ink, and typewriters were in short supply, yet they were expected to coordinate repairs, restore services, and organize relief tasks far larger than their original responsibilities. Relief shipments began arriving by early June. But even this success underscored how dysfunctional the ports had become. In Split, a British vessel carrying emergency food and medical supplies anchored offshore because the main quay could not receive it. Cranes had been destroyed or dismantled during the occupation, and the remaining winches were too weak to handle heavy cargo. Volunteers waded through shallow water, forming human chains to unload sacks by hand. It was exhausting, slow work, made harder by floating debris and unstable surfaces beneath the waves. Everywhere, the sea seemed to push back against the urgency of reconstruction. Navigational charts were useless. Channels that had been safe before the war were now filled with hazards. Fishing fleets vital for the daily food supply were in ruins. Some boats had been seized by Italian and German forces during the war. Others had been burned. Many had been abandoned on beaches, their hulls cracked and their nets stolen or decayed. Fishermen stood on repaired piers, staring at unreachable waters, knowing that even a short trip to set lines or nets could be deadly if the vessel drifted into a minefield. Isolated islands faced even harsher conditions. With shipping halted, some places received no supplies at all for weeks. Reports from Vis describe shortages of flour, oil, and basic medical materials, with residents rationing what remained. On Korčula, one committee noted that entire families had taken shelter in damaged schoolhouses after returning to find their homes unlivable. Improvised shelters, wooden barracks, stone outbuildings, and abandoned warehouses became temporary dwellings. In places, several families lived in single rooms, sharing stoves and water buckets. What infrastructure survived often worked only partially. Electricity flickered in and out. Water systems leaked from broken pipes that had gone unrepaired during the war. Coastal roads, narrow, carved into hillsides, were blocked by landslides from months of neglect and bombing. Bridges were down, forcing carts and early trucks to detour over steep terrain or take slow coastal paths. Even where manpower existed, tools did not. Picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows were as scarce as food. Yet, amid the shortages, pressure grew. Dalmatia depended on its ports, and its ports depended on the sea. Without reopened channels, there would be no steady supply of grain, coal, or fuel. No way to bring returnees home in larger numbers, and no path for the region to take part in the broader reconstruction of Yugoslavia. Every day that ships lay idle offshore was a day lost. Local committees and partisan commanders sent urgent reports to the provisional government in Belgrade and the ministries forming in Zagreb. They described a region technically liberated but practically stranded. Mines prevented even the most basic movement. The Adriatic, once a maritime highway, had become an obstacle almost as destructive as any military front. Clearing it would require not only trained crews and specialized vessels, but also coordination with Allied naval units still operating in the Adriatic. In late spring, small teams began surveying the waters around major ports. They used rowboats and small motorcraft, probing the seabed with long poles or dragging lines to detect obstacles. In some cases, they relied on local fishermen who remembered pre-war depths and currents, helping identify where mines might drift. But these efforts were slow and dangerous, and they could not match the scale of the problem. Archival reports from 1945 describe the Adriatic as one of the densest mine zones in Europe, with fields laid in layers, some German, some Italian, some Allied, each with different mechanisms and fuses. In the meantime, coastal towns lived in a state of partial paralysis. Shops reopened, but shelves were bare. Schools held classes in damaged buildings, sometimes outdoors. Churches and cultural institutions tried to resume routines. Yet, attendance varied as families scattered across islands and the mainland struggled to reunite. The rhythm of daily life existed, but only barely. Everything depended on the sea. And the sea remained closed. By early summer, a realization settled across Dalmatia. Liberation alone could not repair the coast. Before rebuilding houses, shipyards, or industries, before restoring ferries or reviving fishing cooperatives, one task towered above all others. The sea lanes had to be cleared, and the ports had to breathe again. And so the question sharpened with every stranded ship and every hunger report. How do you rebuild a maritime region when the very water surrounding it remains deadly and impassable? The answer would emerge in the months ahead. In the most dangerous reconstruction effort Dalmatia had ever faced beneath the surface of the Adriatic itself. The most urgent reconstruction in Dalmatia did not begin on land, but underwater. As summer 1945 settled over the Adriatic, the coast turned its attention to a threat hidden from sight yet present in every tide. The mines that sealed off the sea, for fishermen, sailors, and the partisan units who now took responsibility for maritime safety, the war's final legacy lay beneath them, silent, unstable, and unpredictable. The sea that had always been Dalmatia's lifeline had become its most dangerous frontier. The task of clearing it began with cooperation between unexpected partners. Although Yugoslavia had liberated its coastline, Allied naval units, primarily British flotillas, still patrolled the Adriatic, and they had both experience and specialized equipment that the new state lacked. Through mid-1945, British officers, Yugoslav naval crews, and a handful of reused Italian minesweepers formed mixed teams. Their goal was simple but immense: to reopen the approaches to Split, Šibenik, and Zadar before winter. Each channel was a requirement for food shipments, fuel deliveries, and the return of displaced families. The first obstacle was knowledge. German forces, retreating in chaos, had destroyed large parts of their navigational logs. Whatever maps remained were incomplete, conflicting, or misleading. Mines had been laid in multiple waves, some by Italian forces during earlier phases of the war, others by the Germans after 1943, and still others by the Allies trying to block Axis supply routes. Some were anchored mines fixed with cables, some magnetic or pressure-triggered. and others improvised devices tied together from naval scrap. Over time, storms and currents had shifted them, breaking up whatever patterns the original fields once had. Minesweepers moved cautiously, running parallel lines through suspected fields. Crews lowered magnetic or acoustic sweep gear and listened for clear signals. When they detected a mine, they marked the spot with buoys, returned later to blow it up from a safe distance, and then began again, lane by lane, day after day. Reports from the period describe long hours of routine broken by moments of sudden danger. Even with Allied support, Yugoslav crews faced serious shortages of tools, replacement cables, and spare parts. One engineer noted that a single snapped wire could delay an entire operation by 48 hours. The risks were constant. Mines detached from their anchors sometimes drifted into cleared channels overnight, forcing crews to repeat sweeps they believed finished. Local fishermen sometimes encountered them floating near shorelines, causing hurried evacuations of beaches and small harbours. In late 1945, a team from Šibenik lost 2 men when an anchored mine exploded unexpectedly during retrieval, an incident that forced crews to adopt more cautious procedures. These losses, rarely reported but quietly noted in internal documents, slowed the pace of operations. Yet the sweepers continued. Gradually, the first safe corridors opened. By early autumn, supply vessels began approaching Split again, sailing between lines of freshly placed buoys. The first convoys carried fuel, grain, and medical supplies. Even then, unloading remained difficult. The port itself was damaged. But the simple arrival of ships brought a sense of momentum to the coast. For the first time since liberation, Dalmatia felt connected to the outside world by something more than wireless messages and overland supply routes. On the islands, the impact was even more direct. Hvar and Brač had survived spring and early summer on local reserves and occasional military deliveries. As soon as temporary channels were declared mostly safe, small boats began moving carefully between the islands and Split. One early post-war diary described how villagers gathered along the shoreline to watch the first mailboat in months, cheering as it rounded the headland with a makeshift white flag showing it had passed safely through the lanes. These early crossings were slow, tightly controlled, and sometimes redirected when crews spotted suspicious objects drifting in currents. But they restored the basic rhythms of island life, food distribution, medical transport, and simple communication. Vis, the most distant island with a strong wartime partisan presence, depended on reopening its routes even more urgently. With its isolation deepened by mines, repairing its connection to the mainland symbolized a return to ordinary civilian life. When the first regular link was set up again in late 1945, it allowed families separated since the early 1940s to reunite and enabled repairs to begin on industries that had remained idle. Even after the first gains, progress remained slow. Zadar, heavily damaged from wartime bombardment and only formally transferred to Yugoslavia after the 1947 peace treaty, was among the last major ports to regain dependable access. Its northern approaches contained some of the thickest minefields in the central Adriatic. Documents from British clearance teams mention complex groups of overlapping German and Italian patterns, many of which needed a second pass in 1946 after newly discovered mines drifted into cleared waters. While the minesweepers worked hard offshore, the coast adjusted to its changed maritime landscape. Fishermen studied new restrictions and changed their routes. Boats avoided traditional grounds until clearance was confirmed, focusing on safer inshore waters. This shift led to temporary shortages. The Adriatic's deeper fishing zones stayed off limits well into 1946. The creation of new fishing cooperatives later helped, but until the lanes fully reopened, the sea could not completely support the communities that depended on it. By the end of 1946, most major approaches were open, though with care. Crews continued to find stray mines even into 1947, the leftover result of a chaotic war that had turned the Adriatic into a patchwork of dangers. Yet the essential change had occurred. The sea was once again passable. What had been an impossible barrier became a controlled risk, manageable through strict rules and constant watchfulness. And with the sea lanes gradually restored, attention shifted back toward the land. Ships could approach Dalmatia again, but what waited for them were ports stripped of cranes, tools, and machines. The scars of wartime scuttling still lay beneath the surface of Split and Zadar. The greatest obstacle was no longer the water, but the crumbling infrastructure rising above it. Now that ships could reach the coast, the question changed. Could Dalmatia's battered ports handle the long-awaited return of maritime life? By early 1946, the Adriatic no longer held Dalmatia in its grip. Mine clearance crews had carved safe lanes back into the sea, and ships once again approached Split, Šibenik, and Zadar. But the opening of the water only revealed the next layer of a deeper crisis. The ports themselves were broken. Even when vessels arrived, they found harbours that could not receive them, quays that could not support their weight, and equipment that had vanished into wartime scrap or been destroyed during retreat. The coastline had regained access to the world, yet lacked the tools to reconnect with it. The condition of each major port reflected its own wartime story. Split, the largest, bore the marks of scuttled ships sunk at its entrance, hulks deliberately blown apart by retreating German naval units to block incoming traffic. Divers described twisted frames and jagged steel plates rising like underwater cliffs. Šibenik's piers, hit by air raids and sabotage during occupation, sagged where concrete had cracked and reinforcement bars rusted away. Zadar, once an Italian administrative centre, had endured some of the heaviest bombing on the eastern Adriatic. Whole sections of its waterfront lay in rubble, with quays reduced to piles of stone spilling into the sea. In every port, the same shortage appeared: the absence of machinery. Cranes had been dismantled or destroyed, winches removed, forklifts seized, and mechanical workshops stripped of tools. A mid-1945 UNRWA assessment noted that Dalmatian harbours had less than 1/10 of their lifting capacity from before the war. Without cranes, unloading even a modest cargo ship became a tiring task. Bags of flour, crates of medical supplies, coils of wire, and heavy barrels had to be moved by teams of volunteers using ropes, wooden ramps, and sheer strength. Cargo that once took an afternoon to unload could take 2 full days. Salvage became the first strategy. Local engineers and shipyard workers searched through the wreckage of sunken Italian and German vessels, looking for anything that could be reused: steel plates for patching piers, lengths of cable for improvised hoists, even intact gears and bearings that could be turned into makeshift winches. In Split's port district, crews pulled parts from a damaged Italian auxiliary ship, later using its metal to reinforce a temporary quay. Each recovered piece of material increased the capability of workers who had almost nothing to work with, but improvisation alone could not match the scale of need. This was where early socialist mobilization found one of its first practical roles. Youth labor brigades, groups of volunteers, many in their teens or early 20s, arrived from Dalmatian towns and inland regions of Croatia and Bosnia. They cleared rubble, hauled stones, repaired seawalls, and carried timber and steel where machines could not reach. Their work was physical, often exhausting, but essential. For a region with little heavy machinery left, manpower became the main resource. These brigades were not just symbolic. Archival notes from Split and Šibenik mention that their efforts sped up quay repairs by months. In places where cranes and industrial tools were absent, teams built wooden gantries, simple A-frame structures, with pulleys that could lift modest loads. They stabilized cracked piers with stone fill and cement from the Stalin plant, one of the few industrial facilities able to restart early. The pace was uneven, and constant shortages slowed progress, but each week brought small improvements. At the same time, port authorities faced another obstacle: debris beneath the waterline. Scuttled ships blocked berths. Sunken vehicles from retreating forces littered harbour floors. Piles of rubble from collapsed warehouses had slid into the shallows. Clearing this required divers, and Dalmatia had only a few trained for such work. Yugoslav naval units provided some help, but they, too, were stretched thin across the Adriatic. Salvage teams had to choose which berths mattered most, leaving secondary piers blocked for months or even years. Yet by late 1946, the first signs of stability appeared. In Split, one of the main quays reopened after months of repairs, allowing a British relief vessel to dock directly rather than anchoring offshore. Šibenik managed to restore enough capacity to handle small coastal freighters, enabling regular shipments of timber and cement. Zadar, still struggling with heavy structural damage, reopened selected parts of its waterfront, though full reconstruction remained years away. These achievements, however, revealed a new pressure building just behind them. As sea lanes opened and ports became partly functional, people began returning home in larger numbers. Families arrived by boat, carrying bundles of belongings, hoping to reclaim houses or apartments abandoned during wartime evacuations. But the housing stock had been devastated. In Zadar, especially, entire neighborhoods are unlivable. Even in Split and Šibenik, population growth quickly outpaced available shelter. Temporary barracks rose on the outskirts of towns, and former storehouses were converted into shared dormitories. For local authorities, the challenge multiplied. Ports needed to handle not only incoming cargo, but also the returning population that depended on steady supplies of food, tools, and reconstruction materials. Each repaired quay increased the flow of goods, but each new ship also showed how much remained undone. Dalmatia was re-establishing its maritime lifeline, yet the communities that once sustained it were only beginning to regroup. By the end of 1946, port repairs had reached enough progress to stabilize relief operations. Grain arrived more reliably. Fuel shipments increased. The first attempts to restart coastal shipping schedules began. Still, the underlying fragility remained clear. A broken crane, a cracked pier, or a missing shipment of cement could delay an entire port for weeks. Everything worked at the limit of its capacity. And as engineers, officials, and volunteer brigades pushed these fragile systems forward, a larger question emerged, one that could not be answered merely by clearing rubble or reusing scrap. Dalmatia's recovery would depend not just on physical repairs, but on the people returning to rebuild their homes, reclaim their streets, and reshape their towns. Ships could now dock. But who would come back to the coast, and what kind of community would they find waiting for them? By 1945's end, the repaired quays of Dalmatia had enabled more than the flow of cargo. They opened the way for people to come home. The Adriatic, once sealed by mines and blocked by wreckage, now carried ferries, fishing boats, and military transports filled with families returning after years of displacement. But the homecomings that unfolded across Split, Šibenik, Zadar, Dubrovnik, and the islands were bittersweet. A region long shaped by movement between islands, across borders, across centuries of maritime trade, now faced the difficult work of putting its population, its identity, and its civic life back together. One of the largest return movements involved the thousands of Dalmatian civilians evacuated to El Shatt, a refugee camp in Egypt's Sinai Desert. They had been sent there in 1944 to escape German offensives and famine conditions. Living in rows of tents pitched on wind-blown sand, they created schools, choirs, newspapers, and a basic sense of community. Yet their world remained temporary, a fragile outpost supported by Allied supplies. When news spread that the war had ended, the camp's residents waited anxiously for ships to take them home. Their return was staggered. The first transports reached Dalmatia in June 1945, while most came back over the next year. Families stepping ashore found cities they barely recognized, towns scarred by bombardment, streets lined with rubble, and neighbors scattered across improvised shelters. Many who had left stone houses returned to find only foundations or charred beams. Housing shortages became one of the defining struggles of Dalmatian reconstruction. In Split, damaged neighborhoods could not absorb the sudden wave of people. Families crowded into barracks built quickly from timber and corrugated metal. Others occupied partially repaired buildings where tarpaulins replaced roofs. In Šibenik and Zadar, families shared apartments divided by blankets or makeshift partitions. Reports from 1946 describe entire streets where doorways had no doors, windows were boarded up with planks, and staircases leaned dangerously. Even where buildings remained standing, basic utilities often did not. Water systems leaked, electricity flickered, and sewage pipes cracked after years of neglect. The return of people did more than strain infrastructure. It reopened questions of identity. Dalmatia's wartime experience had left communities divided. Some islands had been under Italian occupation until 1943, others under German rule, and many residents had faced different political pressures. Villages evacuated to Italy returned with memories of camps and internment. Those who found refuge with the partisans in the hinterland came back with different loyalties and expectations. In some towns, rumors circulated about who had collaborated or fled, who had resisted, who had gained, and who had suffered. Local committees had to manage these tensions carefully, stressing collective rebuilding rather than revenge. Post-war justice remained mostly outside Dalmatia's local responsibilities. The coast's priority was simple survival. Zadar, in particular, stood at the center of a major demographic and political shift. Once a city with a significant Italian-speaking population, it had been annexed by Italy in the interwar period and suffered enormous wartime destruction. Under the 1947 Treaty of Peace with Italy, Zadar was officially transferred to Yugoslavia. This legal change confirmed developments already happening on the ground. Many Italians had left in 1943 to 44, while others departed during the confused final months of the war. Their departure created space, but also left empty homes and administrative positions that the new authorities had to fill. Reconstruction plans for the city included both rebuilding and rethinking, restoring historic streets while fitting them into the new socialist Yugoslav framework. Alongside these changes, communities began restoring their cultural and civic institutions. Schools reopened in damaged buildings, sometimes holding classes outdoors when rooms had no roofs. Teachers returned from exile or military service to classrooms without desks, books, or supplies. Local councils formed cooperatives for agriculture, fisheries, and crafts, aiming to stabilize livelihoods disrupted by years of occupation. In island towns, cooperatives organized the distribution of nets, fuel, and equipment. On the mainland, they coordinated the supply of timber, stone, and cement for home repairs. These efforts varied in success, but they showed a shared determination to rebuild not only structures but social life. In some places, religious and cultural festivals resumed carefully. Churches repaired roofs and windows, choirs came together again, and public squares once more hosted gatherings. These traditions, paused during years of military rule, gave communities a sense of continuity, yet the presence of partisan authorities and the arrival of socialist policies meant that pre-war civic life returned in a changed form. Local committees supervised much of public activity. Political education programs were introduced, and community meetings emphasized unity in reconstruction. Though in 1946 and 1947, the region's transformation accelerated. More returnees arrived, and with them came demands for food, work, and shelter. Some families stayed temporarily with relatives. Others built small extensions onto damaged homes. In mountain villages above the coast, craftsmen descended into town to rebuild doors, staircases, and window frames. The patchwork of reconstruction, partial repairs, temporary structures, and improvised solutions slowly took shape. But the scale of need meant that Dalmatia remained close to the edge of basic survival. Grain shipments were still irregular. Fuel shortages limited electricity production, shipyards and workshops could not yet replace lost machinery. The growing population increased pressure on ports and markets. After 2 years of effort, the people had come home, but the economic foundations needed to support them were still fragile. By 1947, it became clear that rebuilding homes and restoring community life was only the first stage. The region would not survive on emergency repairs and relief shipments alone. It needed industries to function, jobs to stabilize families, and production to replace the constant dependence on outside assistance. The revival of factories, shipyards, and fisheries would determine whether Dalmatia remained a region struggling to stay afloat or one capable of rebuilding itself from the ruins. As returnees settled and local committees gained experience, a new question emerged. Could the industries that once fed the coast be revived quickly enough to support its people, or would the weight of wartime damage and political change pull the region back into stagnation? By 1946, Dalmatia had brought its people home and reopened the sea, but the coast remained carefully balanced between recovery and exhaustion. Relief shipments fed the population and repaired ports, kept minimal traffic moving, yet long-term survival required something more solid, the revival of the industries that had supported the Adriatic economy before the war. Without working shipyards, fisheries, quarries, and salt pans, the region risked slipping into long-lasting dependence on the mainland and international aid. The challenge was immense. But for the planners in Zagreb and the local committees from Split to Korčula, rebuilding industry became the next crucial step. Nationalization shaped the outline of this effort from the start. By mid-1946, Yugoslavia's sweeping laws placed key industries under state ownership: shipyards, cement factories, large workshops, and the salt works in Ston and Pag. The policy aimed to gather scarce resources and prioritize reconstruction over private profit. In Dalmatia, where commercial facilities had been devastated and machinery stolen or ruined, nationalization offered a system of order: centralized purchasing of tools, distribution of coal and steel, and careful planning of which industries should reopen first. But it also meant that local committees often had to wait for approvals and supplies from Zagreb or Belgrade, causing tensions between urgent local needs and broader national goals. Among the most important projects were the shipyards of Split and Trogir. Shipbuilding had long been one of Dalmatia's strongest economic pillars. The war had left both shipyards, battered slipways cracked, workshops without roofs, electrical systems ruined, even basic welding equipment was scarce. In Split, the former Vico Undrich yard, later part of a larger industrial complex, began by repairing its own tools, rewiring motors, salvaging metal beams, and extracting usable machinery from wrecked naval facilities. The first post-war vessels produced here were modest, small, wooden or steel coastal craft meant to restart local transport and fishing fleets. Yet each completed boat represented a step toward restoring Dalmatia's connection to its islands. Trogir faced similar difficulties. Workers labored in sheds with tarpaulin-covered roofs, using shared welding sets. Archival reports mention delays caused by shortages of electrodes and acetylene cylinders. Still, by 1948, the yard had regained basic functionality. The earliest vessels launched were not large ships, but practical craft barges, motorboats, and maintenance vessels designed to solve immediate problems such as carrying stone, timber, or fishing supplies. In an environment where industrial output was measured not by size but by usefulness, these modest achievements carried disproportionate importance. Salt production, one of Dalmatia's oldest industries, also struggled back to life. At the Pag and Ston salt pans, wartime neglect had allowed weeds to grow over evaporation basins. Channels that guided seawater through the system had filled with silt. Workers cleared them using little more than shovels and hand tools, sometimes helped by youth brigades brought in during peak labor periods. Salt was vital not only for local consumption but for national distribution. Reopening these pans meant reducing reliance on foreign imports and restoring a long-standing Dalmatian trade. Quarries and cement plants, too, began to stir. The Solin cement factory near Split managed to restart early, providing the essential material for reconstruction. Stone quarries in Brač and Korčula, famous for their limestone, supplied blocks for piers, workshops, and housing repairs. Barges, repaired just enough to function, carried loads of stone to the mainland. These industries revived slowly, but their output shaped every other sector, including ports, urban rebuilding, and shipyard infrastructure. Fisheries offered a more complicated picture. The war had devastated fleets. Many boats were lost, and those that survived needed heavy repairs. Outboard motors were rare, fuel was scarce, and nets were difficult to obtain. Under the new socialist model, fishermen were encouraged, or in some areas required, to join cooperatives. These cooperatives pooled equipment, organized distribution, and negotiated for supplies from state agencies. While some fishermen welcomed the stability, others missed the independence of pre-war small-scale operations. Still, the cooperative model helped direct scarce engines and nets to areas with the most need. And by late 1947, fish catches had begun to rise, although unevenly. Each industrial revival revealed a trade-off: speed versus quality, improvisation versus long-term planning. National planners wanted efficiency and coordination. Local workers prioritized immediate usefulness. Engineers in Split sometimes pushed forward with repairs that ministries viewed as temporary solutions. Meanwhile, central authorities issued instructions that did not always align with local conditions, such as prioritizing specific shipbuilding projects, even when key materials were unavailable. Dalmatia's reconstruction thus became a negotiation between the center and the region, between necessity and ambition. By 1948, industrial growth showed cautious promise. Shipyards widened their repair schedules, handling not only local boats but vessels from Montenegro and the northern Adriatic. The salt pans reached close to pre-war output in several seasons. Fisheries reported more consistent deliveries to coastal markets. Yet the fragile balance depended heavily on imports: machine parts from the Soviet bloc, fuel from abroad, and occasional relief supplies. This dependence seemed manageable until the summer of 1948, when Yugoslavia's dramatic break with the Soviet-led Cominform changed the entire economic landscape. With the Tito-Stalin Split, the networks that supported Dalmatia's industrial revival suddenly became unreliable. Deliveries of machinery and technical help slowed or stopped. Trade channels narrowed. Projects planned with the expectation of steady Soviet support faced delays or cancellation. In shipyards and factories, workers found themselves short of everything from steel plates to replacement engine parts. The industrial base had revived, but its foundation was still fragile. And now, an external political rupture threatened to undo the progress achieved since 1945. Dalmatia had rebuilt the tools of production, but could these industries survive the shock of a sudden loss of international support, or would the advances of the previous years begin to fall apart? The summer of 1948 arrived quietly along the Adriatic, but its political shockwaves travelled faster than any storm. When Yugoslavia broke with the Soviet-led Cominform, the event seemed distant from the stone quays and shipyards of Dalmatia. Yet within months, the effects reached the coast with unmistakable force. The fragile industrial progress of the previous years, built on improvisation, salvaged parts, and irregular imports, now faced a new reality: the sudden disappearance of much of the technical and material support that reconstruction had depended on. In the months before the split, Dalmatian factories and shipyards had operated under the assumption of a growing connection with the broader socialist economic network. Soviet and Eastern European suppliers provided machine parts, tools, and sometimes specialist training. A planned expansion of electrification in Split's shipyard, for example, depended on equipment expected from Czechoslovakia. When relations collapsed, these channels halted almost overnight. Deliveries in transit were delayed, rechecked, or quietly cancelled. Spare parts ordered months earlier simply never arrived. At first, Engineers and planners tried to adapt by stretching the life of existing equipment. Workshops repaired the same tools again and again, reusing components from broken machines. In Trogir, welders who had relied on imported electrodes improvised substitutes. Though these burned less evenly and slowed work, maintenance crews developed a habit of stripping unusable engines for any remaining working parts. Improvisation, already a key part of early Reconstruction, now became a daily routine, but the pressure grew heavier. With fewer imports, the central government redirected domestic resources toward priority sectors: defense, basic infrastructure, and heavy industry in the interior. Dalmatia, though important, held a vulnerable position in this ranking. Requests for steel or fuel often took weeks to process, and even longer to fulfill. Shipyards reported delays in receiving sheet metal. The cement factory in Solin struggled to secure coal. Fishing cooperatives waited for months for new motor parts. Each setback added to the next, slowing reconstruction and testing the patience of workers who had endured years of shortage. Some relief came, in limited but meaningful forms, from Western channels. Although Yugoslavia did not join any political bloc, the crisis opened the door for cautious cooperation. The United States and United Nations agencies provided modest quantities of grain, machinery, and financial support. These supplies helped stabilize food stocks and kept certain factories running. Small shipments of equipment reached ports in Split and Šibenik, though far from enough to replace the lost Eastern European support. Still, the symbolic value mattered. Dalmatia was not entirely alone. Local authorities reacted by changing their priorities. Shipyards shifted from more ambitious vessel construction to repair work tasks that required fewer new parts and allowed crews to maintain skills. Factories focused on items that could be produced with domestic materials, such as stone products, basic metal fittings, and simpler boats for coastal transport. Fisheries reduced plans to expand motorized fleets and instead focused on keeping existing boats running and on developing methods for fishing closer to shore. Labor mobilization increased as well. Youth brigades, already active in earlier reconstruction efforts, expanded their role. They helped repair roads leading to industrial zones, cleared rubble around ports, and carried materials when trucks or machines were unavailable. Their presence filled workforce gaps and strengthened a growing sense of resilience, even as conditions remained difficult. Fuel shortages created another serious problem. Electricity production faltered, leading to irregular outages that affected workshops and residential areas alike. In Split, rolling blackouts forced shipyard crews to adjust their shifts to match available power. Welders sometimes worked in open-air spaces by daylight when indoor lighting failed. The rhythm of reconstruction became dictated not by plans or quotas, but by the unpredictability of resources. Despite the crisis, progress did not stop. It simply changed shape. By late 1949, Dalmatian ports had regained enough capacity to support regular coastal shipping. Small ferries and cargo vessels reconnected the mainland with the islands, carrying passengers, fish, timber, and salt. Even modest industrial output kept local economies functioning. The shipyards launched more repair-ready vessels, and fisheries achieved steady, if limited, catches. Cement production in Solin stabilized, allowing housing repairs to continue across urban districts. But the nature of reconstruction had shifted. The optimism of 1946 and 1947, built on hopes of abundant supplies and expanding industrial horizons, gave way to a more cautious and self-reliant spirit. Workers understood that progress would happen not because conditions were favorable, but because communities adapted to difficulty. A sense of collective determination grew out of necessity. The political crisis also encouraged new administrative approaches. Local committees gained more autonomy, as central institutions burdened by national priorities delegated more responsibility. In Split and Zadar, planners began creating modernist urban designs that tried to balance historical preservation with the need for functional housing and infrastructure. These plans formed slowly, often limited by shortages, but they reflected a longer-term vision growing out of the turmoil. By 1950, Dalmatia had weathered the worst of the economic impact. Ports, still imperfect, operated reliably. Workshops stabilized production. Shipyards completed regular repair schedules, even if expansion remained limited. A new balance had formed, less ambitious than early post-war goals, but stronger and more practical. Yet, the crisis left one key question unanswered. Dalmatia had survived through resilience, improvisation,